If you want to save democracy, I'm going to need you to start smoking 2 packs a day. Let me explain. In 1783, the United States had won the Revolutionary War, but we were broke and there were all sorts of problems. The Continental Army hadn't been paid and the country was on the verge of revolt. George Washington, basically the only person in the country who had the level of respect, esteem, and reputation to quell the bubbling rebellion, he went before the Continental Army, and as he stood before them, he pulled out his speech, and then he very famously put on a pair of spectacles. And he looked out at the crowd of soldiers, and he said, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me. I've grown gray in your service, and now I fear I'm going blind." The sight of their beloved hero, old and infirm, worn down, moved them into tears and allowed them to quell the rebellion. George Washington was 51 years old. Not even 2 years older than me, 10 years younger than Brad Pitt, about a year and a half older than Tom Brady, right? Not that old. And in fact, one of the things I think that people forget is that for most of American history, especially the early part, our leaders were pretty young. The average age of a senator in the very first Senate was about 47 years old. The oldest senator, in fact, was 61, I believe. The average age of a United States senator today is 65. In any time or any period, it's important that there's like a churn in the democratic process. New voices come through, new perspectives. We haven't had that in America. We've had a boomer president since 1992, except for the 4 years when Biden was president, and he's not a boomer because he's too old. The people who rule us right now, who govern us, they don't represent our life experiences or perspectives. To take but one example, Chuck Grassley, senator from Iowa, this is the world that he was born into. He was born at a time when China was in civil war between the nationalists and the communists. A big part of the northern chunk of the country was actually owned by Japan. In Germany, Paul von Hindenburg was president. The most powerful computing device that existed was literally 1/10 billionth the power of the device that I have in my hand right now, an iPhone. Everything was completely different. And this is the person that we're supposed to help us understand and craft legislation related to AI and deal with the rising challenge of China, right? These are things that his experience simply hasn't equipped him to deal with. And also, because the boomer generation has kind of this stranglehold on power, there are multiple generations whose perspectives are simply not heard. And that's a problem. So what does this have to do with smoking 2 packs a day? Well, one of the problems, right, if you can think of it that way, is that public health has extended our lifespan, right? And so people live longer and they live better. And so, in the past, at 50, you could be pretty bedraggled, pretty rough and worn out, you could be dead. And so you wouldn't have this chokehold on power in quite the same way. Maybe we need to get back, having people smoke a little bit more, not live as long. Of course, I'm being snide. I'm telling a joke. And in fact, it's actually not true. Because one of the interesting things about the founders, and people often get this wrong when it comes to life expectancy, is that most of them lived a long time. If you think of like the top 10 or 12 most important founders, however you make the list, the average lifespan was something like 75 years, which is almost exactly what an adult male, well, the life expectancy of a man in the United States is now. And it's, pulled down a little bit because Alexander Hamilton had to go pop off to Aaron Burr. So he died in his 40s. So maybe it isn't strictly speaking a matter of people living longer. It's just that there's no longer a civic spirit where you put in your time and then you get your gold watch and you move forward. And ultimately, right, that's the lesson of George Washington. When he stepped down at the ripe old age of 64, which again would have made him today like almost a spring chicken in the Senate. When he stepped down at the age of 64, he set a precedent that, you know, it's time to move on. Let the next generation have the baton. And I don't know how exactly we accomplish this. Part of this is a function of the powerful grip that incumbency has, the benefits of incumbency when you're running elections. Part of it is, I think, a generational thing, and we can be critical of how boomers have been unwilling to cede power or influence. And so many of our policies are sort of designed to keep wealth and importance within that demographic. But something has to be done because we need a kind of churn. We need new ideas and new perspectives. Because younger people who are more familiar with the internet, right, who understand that China is a wealthy country with an important role to play in the world, they need to start taking control. And I don't know, cigarettes aren't probably the answer. And I hate to be such a downer, so I guess maybe I'll leave you guys today with this. If any of you are big fans of the musical Hamilton, you'll remember that George Washington stepped down, as I just noted, and he let Alexander Hamilton know that there's a time for every season and I'm gonna move on. So that's what I'm gonna leave you with. I'm gonna give you my rendition of that famous song because I think in these trying times, it's really only music that can bring us together. So here's my rendition of One Last Time from Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton.